In the summer of 1940, an archaeologist named Sidney Wheeler was crawling through dry caves in the Nevada desert, cataloging what the guano miners hadn't destroyed yet. Then a rattlesnake lunged at him. He twisted sideways, dodged the strike, and wrecked his ankle. He couldn't walk, so he and his wife Georgia limped into the nearest shade they could find, an unexplored cave close to the road, 13 miles east of Fallon, Nevada, and waited for a passing car in the heat. They were trained archaeologists. They couldn't just sit there. While they waited, they started looking around. And what they found inside that cave would ignite a 20-year legal war, destroy a scientific theory, and force an entire country to ask a question it had been avoiding for a century. Who does America really belong to? Buried in the dry floor of that cave were two bodies wrapped in tule matting woven from a marsh plant, 67 artifacts, knives, animal bones, baskets, and one of the bodies was different, the deeper one. The head and right shoulder had been preserved by the bone-dry air of the cave. Natural mummification, no embalming, no ritual, just the desert doing what the desert does. The man was wearing leather moccasins stitched together from 3 different kinds of animal skin, sewn with 2 types of stitching. He was wrapped in a rabbit skin blanket. A twined tule mat had been carefully sewn around his head and shoulders. The Wheelers estimated he was maybe 1,500 to 2,000 years old but not remarkable. They photographed him, placed him in a sealed box, and shipped him to the Nevada State Museum in Carson City. The following summer, he was displayed at the Nevada State Fair. Then he was placed on a shelf, and there he stayed for 54 years. I need to pause on that. 54 years. The oldest mummy in North America, and nobody knew. He sat in a sealed box on a museum shelf while the people who found him grew old and died. Sidney and Georgia Wheeler never learned what they had actually discovered. They went to their graves thinking they had found a mildly interesting burial from a couple of millennia ago. In 1994, a researcher at the University of California, Riverside, named Irv Taylor, decided to test a batch of old museum specimens using a method that hadn't existed when the Wheelers were alive: accelerator mass spectrometry, AMS radiocarbon dating. It counts individual carbon-14 atoms. It can date a sample the size of a grain of rice. Taylor ran 17 samples from Spirit Cave, hair, bone, textiles, wood. The number that came back was not 1,500 years, it was not 2,000. The man in the box had died approximately 10,600 years ago. Around 7420 BC, that made him the oldest known human mummy in North America, one of the oldest dated human remains on the continent. Donna Kerner, the researcher who ran the dating, said it plainly. It was totally unexpected. They thought their equipment was broken. They ran the tests again. The dates held. On April 27, 1996, the New York Times published the story, and that was the moment Spirit Cave stopped being a museum curiosity and became a battlefield. Because the moment those dates went public, 2 things happened simultaneously. The first, scientists wanted to study the remains. The skull had an unusual shape, elongated with a robust facial structure. 2 physical anthropologists, Douglas Owsley at the Smithsonian and Richard Jantz at the University of Tennessee, measured the skull and announced that it did not resemble modern Native Americans. They said it looked more like Polynesian populations, or Ainu from Japan, or some archaic Asian group that no longer exists. This fed directly into a theory that was already circulating, one called the Paleoamerican hypothesis, the idea that the first people in the Americas were genetically distinct from and unrelated to modern indigenous peoples. that the original Americans were replaced or absorbed by later arrivals. And if that was true, it carried an implication that nobody was saying out loud, but everyone could hear. If the earliest Americans weren't the ancestors of today's tribes, then the moral weight of indigenous land claims shifted. The bones became political. The second thing that happened, the Fallon Paiute-Shoshone Tribe filed a legal claim. They lived 10 miles from Spirit Cave. They had lived in that region by their own account since time immemorial. They called the mummy the Storyteller, and they wanted him back. Their claim was filed under NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990. The law says that if cultural affiliation can be established between ancient remains and a modern tribe, the remains must be returned. The Bureau of Land Management, the federal agency with jurisdiction over the cave, looked at the claim and said no, the remains were too ancient. No cultural connection could be proven across 10,000 years. And then the fight got ugly. In November 2001, the NAGPRA Review Committee heard the tribe's case and voted 6-1 in their favor. They found that the evidence supported a relationship between the Fallon Paiute-Shoshone and the Spirit Cave individual. The BLM ignored the recommendation, did not comply. In September 2006, a federal court ruled that the BLM's decision had been arbitrary and capricious, that they had dismissed the tribe's evidence without adequate justification. The Bush administration appealed. The case was eventually dropped. Through all of this, the tribe kept fighting. They spent over $300,000 in legal fees and research consultations over 2 decades. $300,000 to bring one man home. I think about that number, a small tribe in rural Nevada, spending money they did not have for 20 years because they believed a 10,000-year-old man belonged to their family. You can agree or disagree with the legal theory, but you cannot call that anything other than conviction. And then a Danish geneticist walked into the story. His name was Esker Willerslev. He held positions at the University of Copenhagen and Cambridge. He had already done what most scientists in this field considered impossible. He had sequenced the DNA of Kennewick Man, another ancient skeleton that had been caught in the same war between science and sovereignty, and proved that Kennewick Man was Native American. That result led directly to repatriation. Willerslev contacted the Fallon Paiute-Shoshone about Spirit Cave. The tribe said no, they had been burned before. Scientists had measured and analyzed and published and never given anything back. DNA testing meant drilling into bone. It meant allowing strangers to extract something sacred. Willerslev visited Fallon. He was turned away. He came back, turned away again. He came back a third time. He told them what had happened with Kennewick Man. He made a promise. If the DNA showed the man was Native American, the mummy would go home. The tribe made what one academic paper later called a gut-wrenching decision. They said yes. 2 tribal members flew to Copenhagen to be present while the samples were taken. The DNA was extracted from the petrous bone, the densest bone inside the skull, the best source of ancient genetic material. The results destroyed the Paleoamerican hypothesis in a single data set. The Spirit Cave individual was not Polynesian. He was not Ainu. He was not some vanished people unrelated to anyone alive. He was an ancestor of present-day Native Americans, full stop. His genetic profile placed him firmly within the southern Native American branch, alongside the Anzic child from Montana and the Lagoa Santa individual from Brazil. People separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all part of the same deep lineage. Willerslev said it directly. Looking at the bumps and shapes of a head does not help you understand the true genetic ancestry of a population. You can have people who look very different but are closely related. The skull measurements that had fueled 20 years of argument meant nothing. The science that was supposed to prove the tribe wrong proved them right. On November 22nd, 2016, the Bureau of Land Management formally transferred the Spirit Cave remains to the Fallon Paiute-Shoshone Tribe. In the summer of 2018, a private reburial ceremony was held. Willerslev was invited and attended. He later described it, people crying, singing, and praying as the mummy was placed inside a casket and offered farewell gifts. He said that for the tribe, it was like burying a father, a mother, a brother. The exact location of the burial was not disclosed. It never will be. And in April 2025, a paper was published in American Antiquity, co-authored by scientists and tribal members together, documenting 10,000 years of unbroken genetic continuity from the Paleo-Indians at Spirit Cave through the Lovelock culture to modern Paiutes. No population replacement, no vanished race, one continuous line stretching from the floor of a Nevada cave to the people who still live 10 miles from it. What stays with me about Spirit Cave is not the DNA. It is not the legal battle or the dates or the politics. It is that a rattlesnake made a man stumble into the right cave. That a mummy sat in a box for half a century because nobody thought to ask the right question. That a tribe spent 20 years and every dollar they could find to bring home a man they called the Storyteller, a man who had been dead for 100 centuries, and that the science everyone used to keep him away from them was the same science that in the end proved he had been theirs all along, somewhere in a museum drawer, on a shelf, in a storage room nobody has opened in decades. There is another box, and inside it is a story that no one has thought to redate, retest, or reimagine. If stories like this are why you're here, subscribe, because the next one is already sitting there waiting.